Professor Pitlo, it seems that this year, ASEAN 50 years anniversary has been quite an event in Manila.
Thank you. Yeah, it is. There's a lot of positive optimism about the recently concluded meetings, and we hope to carry on this momentum on this coming November's summit and the EAS as well.
Mr. Paal, we see during this year's ASEAN meeting, not only the ASEAN issues are being handled, but thorny issues, even as hard as the DPRK nuclear crisis, has also got a new platform to be discussed, because the two Korean foreign ministers were there, and the DPRK foreign minister were interacting with many of the other colleagues, in fact, not just rubbing shoulders. It's quite amazing, isn't it, Mr. Paal?
It is, and it's one of the great benefits of ASEAN's existence, is that it provides a relatively neutral platform for disputants to meet on equal terms. And ASEAN is not a great power by itself or individually the 10 states, but collectively they can stage events where thorny issues can be discussed by the parties involved. So I think this is one of the strengths of ASEAN. There are also some weaknesses, but this is one of the strengths.
When you think about ASEAN, whether it's weakness or strong points of it, you have to reflect back, Mr. Pitlo, of its history. I mean, 50 years ago, think about that. ASEAN started out of nowhere, out of the ruins, in fact. And at the time, even Singapore, the country itself, only 2 years old after it became independent from Malaysia. These were all dramatic changes taking place in Southeast Asian countries. And despite a lot of skepticism, it seems that ASEAN is growing and having bigger influence. A few hundred millions of populations anyway in that trade bloc, and it's getting ever bigger a voice. I wonder, as an expert from the region, how do you reflect about this part of the history?
Exactly. You mentioned very well that initially there was a lot of pessimism about whether ASEAN as a bloc and as a regional association can actually prosper and be at the place where it is right now. But again, there's a lot of incentive for the 10 member states to actually bond together and be a platform for interaction amongst themselves, and as well as to invite the major powers.
Major powers, Mr. Paal, of course, the ASEAN countries has to play it well and smartly in order to exert more influence in this part of the world and elsewhere in the world. Mr. Paal, what do you think their job this time?
Well, I think the 50th anniversary by itself is to be celebrated. As we just discussed, this organization was born at a time when there were many insurgencies within countries and many disputes between countries in Southeast Asia. And this was a way of finding means to manage those disputes and to deal with the insurgencies. We also had the big Vietnam War through a lot of this period. The fact that ASEAN is still standing, that the ministers still turn up, we'll have leaders later this year turning up for the meetings. This is just survival in the modern world is an achievement.
Right.
But they've got more to point to than just that.
You know, we are going to discuss some of the China-related issue a bit later when our Chinese panelists join us. But for now, Mr. Pitlo, there have been a lot of comparing ASEAN today with, let's just say, EU, which is another biggest bloc of countries in the world. Some say it's comparable, and others say it's not. Some say this is much more about the trade. But certainly you see in diplomacy, ASEAN now is also playing a role. How do you make that comparison?
Well, I think it's very tempting to make comparisons, but again, if we look at the nature and the origins of ASEAN and that of EU, the divergences are also very stark. And I think the purposes behind the integration and behind the formation of ASEAN and that of EU are also different. If we look back in time when ASEAN was formed, there was the ideological divide between the East and the West in the context of the Cold War. And yes, there were a lot of disputes also among member states. And I think ASEAN was able to see the value of creating an association that will try to address these disputes amongst themselves, and at the same time try to carve an autonomous space from interference from external powers. So I think the nature and the origins of ASEAN are in a way of a bit different from that of EU. So to make a comparison may not necessarily be accurate.
That's right. But Professor Pitlo, you've been inviting, ASEAN itself this time, foreign ministers from China, the United States, Russia, the two Koreans, not to mention also from Japan as well. All of these countries have differences and some common grounds as well. So ASEAN, among yourself, you also have differences as to which to get closer to, how to interact among them. Is this more of a challenge to you or more of an opportunity, do you think, to the ASEAN? Particularly this time, the host country is the Philippines.
I think you can look at it both ways. But if you try to look at the positive side, ASEAN can be a platform to actually find the least common denominator among, there will be differences amongst member states and differences between the powers that try to interact with ASEAN. So if concerned parties will try to look at the differences, there's a lot. But if concerned parties will try to find some common ground, ASEAN can actually provide a platform by which those common ground can be expanded and become platforms or opportunities for cooperation.
That's true. And now we are also joined by a Chinese panelist, Mr. Cui Hongjian, who is a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Sir, welcome to our program. So let's jump right there into the discussion taking place at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. One is about the code of conduct that China signed with the ASEAN countries. Mr. Cui, some say it's a victory for all sides. Others say we still don't know because it really depends on how the negotiation will go later this year, if it happens. Mr. Cui.
Yeah, also, you know, I think firstly we should give great congratulations to ASEAN for its 15th.
We just did.
Yeah.
So what about the China issue?
Yes, I think that yes, the COC undoubtedly, in my own opinion, is a very great progress for this issue, especially between China and some member states of ASEAN. But of course, now I think that we should be more practical on this issue. Yes, I understand that maybe some real points from maybe some public opinion in some ASEAN countries say that I think now the bigger patience and also a long-term, cooperation, dialogue, exchange will be very, very critical for this success of the COC. But of course, I think we can also find out the continuity between the COC and the DOC. I think it's a good showcase for the China and all of the other, member states of ASEAN to show the sincerity to deal with this issue.
Mr. Paal, at the same time, there were some statements coming from the ASEAN countries, in a way suggesting about issues related to the South China Sea. What do you make of the languages in that statement? And what do you think might be the result of the statement on the future impact of the already concluded COC agreement between ASEAN countries and China?
Well, what we have now is not really a conclusion of the COC agreement, but a framework for getting to the conclusion.
Yeah.
And I think that the statement that came out of the meeting was intended to maintain the momentum toward that conclusion. The current arrangements do not bind the governments, and the rules that are being drafted are not yet enforceable. And to get to that, we're going to need a lot of effort between the 10 in ASEAN and China. And that's going to be something that can easily be diverted if you start raising negative issues. So ministers have been talking about how this is a positive step forward. It's a good thing to have in hand, but not to get our hopes too high because we still have the tough negotiations ahead.
What do you think, Professor Pitlo? We understand that even among the agreements that you signed, in fact, there were some specific timings. First of all, the Chinese foreign minister talking about this possible negotiation later this year if no other parties, outside parties involved. And then there was the Susan Thornton, the top diplomat coming from the United States, talking about the U.S. stance on some of the issues related to the South China Sea. And then we see later a statement coming from the so-called ASEAN countries stating some various different views about what to go ahead. What do you think about this sequence and eventually this statement vis-a-vis the real agreement about the framework of the COC between ASEAN countries and China?
I think there is a positive momentum in terms of ASEAN and China holding negotiations to try to push forward the early conclusion of a COC. But then again, whether this COC will become legally binding, I think this is a major point that several states, member states, and China will have to discuss. I understand that some states would like to make the COC a legally binding document, but there are some who would like to consider this more as a precursor or more as a stepping stone towards progress for a more binding document at some time in the future.
All right.
So there's a tussle between those two camps.
Apparent divide of opinions among the ASEAN countries about what to do and what is the nature of this agreement of framework for COC between China and ASEAN. Let's go to our Chinese panelists. Mr. Cui, what do you think is the initiative for China to sign that agreement or come to that agreement about framework? And secondly, how does China want it to work? Because after all, two parties, both parties have to come together in order to make something work.
Yeah, I think that just like I mentioned before, that we should take notice of this very big progress, especially from Chinese side. Because also, we can find out China's big efforts to have any compromise with all of these ASEAN member states. Also, China, previously, China insisted that, okay, we have a DOC, we don't need any kind of, new document like COC. But how about what happened at this moment? I think it shows Chinese sincerity and China's big willingness to deal with this issue seriously. So I think especially from American or some other outsiders, I think we should take more patience for that. And it's just a biggest, a starting point for a long-term process to deal with this issue.
Right, Mr.
And
Paal.
also I require a kind of a bigger patience from states of ASEAN.
Mr. Paal, do you think Washington will be patient in terms of, it's not exactly Washington's matter, first of all, and secondly, any kinds of overstatement to a certain extent will always make things much more complicated in the region because after all, U.S. has been a player in the region for decades.
Well, the United States is not a direct party in the negotiations, and China is very vocal about not wanting to see the U.S. involved or other powers such as Japan or Korea. But the outcome of these negotiations could have a very big effect on American, Japanese, Korean, and other interests. So we're not uninterested parties, and we will have views to express. Now, you said that sometimes language gets out of control, and with a free media in the U.S. and lots of different views, it's very hard to dial in just the right tone and just the right words. But I think the general expression of American interest in maintaining freedom of navigation, principles of openness and access, and abiding by international rules and standards are things that should not be a matter to be objected to and are largely subscribed to by the ASEAN countries.
All right.
And the question is, how do we, as outsiders, protect our interests in a negotiation by others.
But Mr. Paal, if I could just follow up very briefly, you know, China's economic interest is everywhere in the world these days as well. So can China argue about the issue related to the United States in agreement with other countries that say, we have an interest here, so we're going to always say something that we want to say under any circumstances, no matter what the result is? Mr. Paal, just a follow-up question for you, very briefly.
Absolutely, it's coming. It's coming. China, a few years ago, did not have those far-flung interests and chose to remain silent on many issues. But as we're seeing with the Chinese shipping that passes through the Suez Canal and the